Boy, Jane got a little preachy there, didn't she? Yeah, I tried to make it shorter, but it was just too much fun. Okay, it's such a long thing. Let's all leap like calves of joy. Everyone stand up. We're gonna stretch a little bit here. Okay. Let those hands go way up there like you're the refiner's fire. Go ahead and stretch all the way to Jerusalem over there. Go around the planet over there. Okay, you've laughed enough. Let's preach now. Okay. So, some of you have not been here the last couple of weeks. 2 weeks ago, we explained the whole Bible. 3 sentences, it's done. No more questions. Right? Last week, we tackled God. We explained God in 3 sentences. This week, heaven and hell. We're going to knock it out of the park. I bet some of you have questions about heaven and hell. Some of you have heard stories about these like cartoonish and sinister ideas of pitchforks and lakes of fire. Some of you have heard these beautiful good stories like everyone in heaven is going to be walking around in long robes singing Baptist hymns with fat baby angels playing the harp. Like, I don't know. I don't really want to spend 10 minutes doing that. So, but today we're going to clear it all up. We're going to clear everything about heaven. Here's a secret. We're not going to clear it all up. But some of you are going to be more confused. You're welcome. We're going to start with this journey with the guy named Malachi. However, pause. Why do we think that Malachi is a guy in the Bible? It's a boy's name now, right? Malachi but that's not a boy's name back then. This is about 450 years before Jesus. The word Malach, that's the word. The I is like a preposition. My messenger. It means it's just a title. My messenger. In the New Testament, that gets translated my angel. Messenger and angel are the same word. Second issue, Malach doesn't have grammatically it's not masculine or feminine. You know, in English, like John is a man's name and Johanna is a woman's name. In Spanish, like there's a lot of names where it's really clear. It's male or female. Most languages, it's pretty clear. There's no gender. It's both or neither for Malach. And C, did you notice how important it was for Malachi to protect women in that story? It's not just because I watched Barbie last night. It's all that fed into the story. Yeah, and I made sure to translate that in ways that are appropriate for our context, in language that's appropriate for us, but that's the language in the Bible. Malachi could have been a guy who grew up and saw that his mother was thrown to the curb, and he said when he was a teenager, I'm going to grow up and protect people like that. Or it could have been a woman who just wanted to fix the issues of society, writing under a pseudonym. I mean, if you want to just imagine this question of the day, what would the world be like if we were living under God's total harmony? Wouldn't we listen from more women, for more women? Wouldn't that be part of God's message? So what does that have to do with heaven and hell? A whole lot, it turns out. Okay, so Malachi, funky little book. That's the series, funky little books. Somebody wrote it after Zechariah. Somebody wrote it after, we did the history last week. The Jews were sent to exile, and then some of them eventually came back. Somebody wrote it for those Jews who came back. Somebody wrote Malachi particularly when the Jews came back and they were rebuilding their country, and they ran into more problems than they expected. Somebody wrote it for people, this is the kind of people they were. We had hopes, they're not working out. I had dreams, they're falling apart. Somebody wrote it for people who, they just started, this is usually slow. They start slouching into these questions, and eventually they say them out loud. They say, they think them first, did I make the right decision doing this? And then they might say out loud to their buddy, is there any way out of this? Is there another path I can take? And then they come to church and they say, is God really here in this mess? Because nothing's working. This is my favorite, that is the laser to my past so much. If we're going to try so hard, if we're going to do so much work, and nothing changes, nothing fixes, what's the point? So this is, you can go read Malachi if you want, but prophet talk is really complicated, so do that, carefully. But prophets have this way of writing. It's really hard for us to understand, but for them, it was super inspirational for people who had those same questions in their hearts and in their conversations. So you might imagine it kind of a divine therapy here. Imagine your therapy appointment. You said, hey, doc, I don't know what the point is anymore. My life I was on a path, and it seems like everything I put energy into, it doesn't work. Now imagine your therapist saying, oh, you just need to believe harder. You just need to work harder. You're lazy. Make sure you come and pay me every week, or else you're going to burn in hell. Right? So that is exactly how a lot of Christians, that's how they read these stories. That's what they think is going on. They start from that assumption that that's what prophets are saying, but that's not what they're saying at all. That's not what you heard from Jane. Some prophets do say things like, it sounds like you're going through hell. Tell me more about that. Okay? That's a good therapist. Some prophets will say, I think you should keep trying because I believe in you. Sometimes that's the right answer. Some prophets will say things like, okay, here are some strategies, here are some affirmations that might help you take the next step. I tell you what, in therapy, if you give the wrong affirmation at the wrong time, it doesn't land. You give the right one at the right time, it can be transformative. So here's what Malachi says to these people who sound a lot like us 2,500 years ago. It sounds like you're stuck, and sometimes you're blaming yourself for being stuck. And that's heavy. But have you ever considered just how hard it is to be you in the time we live? To be us, to be anyone in the time we live? This is 2,500 years ago. Broken politics, questionable economy, exhaustion without it really meaning anything. Friends and family no longer live in one place. They live all over, so you have to go everywhere and travel, or you don't see them. The values you hold so dear are being challenged. So many of the things that you rely on, that you think you understand, are crumbling all around us. And none of that is your fault. None of that is your fault. In fact, through all of that, you're still standing. Or if you're not still, if you're kind of kneeling once in a while, just consider, in our time there is an army of marketers and politicians trying to tell you stories about that you are not good enough and what you need and you'll never be good enough. So all that. The fact that you're able to resist it all is miraculous enough and shows how strong you are. The fact that you can voice your frustration clearly, the fact that you can choose to come with other people who are having the same frustrations and make steps forward. Do you know how much strength it takes to get there? So before you place the weight of the world on your shoulders, before you heap suffering on top of suffering, look at the systems that are harming you. Look at the leaders who are failing us, and give yourself some grace and be gentle to your soul. That's what Malachi is saying. Don't blame yourself. Look at these idiot leaders who are leading the place. I'm one of those, because it said religious leaders, so anytime it's pointed to me. Number 2, imagine next week in divine therapy and exercise. Imagine Malachi says to you, let's do a thought experiment. Just close your eyes and picture what it would be like if everything was healed. Not just you. It's not just fixed. It's not just you can deal with it. What would it be like for you to thrive? What would that feel like? What would that take? What would it feel like to hold on to some purpose and some joy? What would it be like to be able to feel like you are in control because you have let go of some things? What would it be like if the totality of God's peace and justice were here on earth, as they say, as it is in heaven? It's equality, it's loyalty, it's protection, it's hope. So you come back a third week from Malachi. Malachi says, you've spent some time thinking about God's reign and the ways that is broken here, and the people who are so responsible for breaking that here. And if you're normal, you probably have a little sense, a little hint that, oh man, wouldn't it be great if we could get back at those people? All of us at some point. If this is not you, you're weird. When you've seen someone on TV and you've wished retribution on them. Okay? Yeah. Yeah, and sometimes they deserve it, right? But the good therapist says, let's work through that. And if you're imagining total healing for all, let's work through that. If we imagine total healing, think about the liars and the cheaters and the greedy and the racists. Would they just burn up and go away? Or, as Malachi said, would their arrogance and wickedness burn away from them so that they might atone and apologize and lead others away from that behavior? I'm not saying you have to forgive them. Forgiveness is a long process. And don't forgive anyone unless they do their redemptive work. But if they took part in the healing of the brokenness they created, how would that feel for you? So in different language than Malachi uses exactly, that's what he's saying. Now, what does that have to do with heaven and hell? A whole lot. A whole lot. Or not very much, depending on the perspective that you choose to come at it. It does not have to do much with the typical American idea of heaven and hell that bears little resemblance to anything in the Bible and zero resemblance to anything in the Old Testament. I said that. The typical American idea of heaven and hell has absolutely nothing to do with anything in the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, and if you grew up Southern Baptist, this is going to blow your noodle. In the Old Testament, they thought at most when people died, their souls, whatever they call it, would go to a pit together. That's the word, pit. The good people and the bad people, the men and the women, the Jews and the other, the rich and the poor, everybody goes to the pit. Is it awesome? No. Is it terrible? No. It just is. The pit just is. Now, they thought that because they could not imagine that with God, the end is the end. They had to assume, they thought the way God works is there's always more, there's always better. So they just thought it had to keep going. 75% of the Bible, that's the closest idea we have to any conception of heaven and hell. And 0% of Christians believe that. Now, they did think that God lived in the heavens, plural, lowercase h, and the heavens included where the birds fly and where the clouds are and where the stars are. And some people thought, if God lives in the heavens, well, I'd love to go hang out with God. And so you might remember the story early in the Old Testament, the Tower of Babel. The whole point is they wanted to go live with the gods. That didn't work out well. You can go read that one. It's like page 6 of the Bible. But sometime around Malachi, sometime 450, 400, two things started to happen at the same time. One, they had rebuilt the temple, and they'd rebuilt all of Jerusalem. And when you're building something, if you've ever done construction, if you've ever done a remodeling, one of the first things you have to think about is where to put the dumpster. Okay, if you're going to remodel your kitchen, you remodel your kitchen. Remember, like maybe you put the dumpster in a good place so you could continue to drive around it. Maybe you didn't think about that, and the dang thing was in the way the whole time. When they rebuilt Jerusalem, put the walls up, they had to have a town dump. If you've been to Jerusalem, you may have gone to the Wailing Wall. It's on the west side. Well, the southern wall was sitting on a hill, the Temple Mount. And at the bottom of that hill is where they threw the trash. It was called the Valley of Hinnom. No one knows who Hinnom was, just a dude's name, Hinnom. In Hebrew, it's Gin Hinnom. It's still there in Jerusalem. If you want to get out your phone, you can go to Google Maps, you can go to Apple Maps, you can go to Google Earth, whatever you got. You can spell it in there. Valley of Hinnom, Jerusalem. It's going to zoom in right there. You'll see there's a couple paths up to the Temple Mount. You'll see there's a road on the far southern side of the valley. If you've seen Schindler's List, the last scene where they're putting rocks on his grave, that's on the far west side of the valley. He's buried with a lot of Jewish dignitaries. Center of the valley, empty. It was the town dump, and now there's a little bit of a park, but mostly it's just scrubland. In some of the most fought land in the world, it's just empty, just sitting there empty. Now, back in Malachi's day, that was the new town dump. Been there 50 or 60 years. And people would walk from all around town, and they would cast away all their trash, and then, so it wouldn't sit and stink, they would burn it. So the smoke was dark, and the fire kept burning, and the rats would gnaw on the little pigeon bones forever. Okay, that's one thing that happened. Second thing that happened, especially a couple generations after Malachi, There were people who did not process their grief. That first story I was telling you about, I feel like I'm stuck and I can't get anywhere and it's all their fault. Okay, we try to process it. Not everyone does it well. Culturally, there were a lot of people in Israel who were not processing that grief. Might sound familiar. People in existential crises do not always make good choices. And these folks started to imagine, well, instead of just a pit where everyone goes when they die, what if God punished the bad ones? Because that'd be fair. And I like fair. We all like fair. What if God punished the bad ones? What if those people who hurt me got what they deserve? What if the people whose fault it is that all this is broken, what if they burned in the town dump in the valley of Hinnom, full of darkness and everlasting fire? Now, there is no evidence whatsoever that anyone actually was sent into the fire. There's no sacrifices. But it was just a nasty thought. It was a nasty thought that just kind of made someone feel better, that their enemies were being burned. And by the time about 300 years before Jesus, some people thought, well, if my vengeance demands their suffering, God's vengeance demands their suffering. And all of a sudden, people started to believe that the Valley of Hinnom was more than just a Valley of Hinnom. Anyone have a guess what the English translation to Gen Hinnom is? Hell. Hell came first. It was an idea for people whose vision did not include full healing for themselves or for the people that hurt them. But what did Malachi say to people just like this? What did he say about fire specifically? We saw it up there. You may have been so used to seeing prophet talk about fire, you just assumed it was punishment. But what he said was, it is for refining. It is for burning away the impurities. It is for creating something better that comes out the other side. And Jesus lands right there. Jesus talks about fire. He barely talks about hell. Like 10 times, maybe 11, Jesus talks about it. And almost every one of them, just like Malachi, he's not talking to you, he's talking to me. He's talking to religious leaders. In fact, he's standing on the steps of the temple, and he's looking down at the valley. It's probably on fire all the time. And he's saying things to people like me. He's saying, it would be better for you, if you're doing damage to God's reign of peace, it would be better for you to go jump in this fire than to keep hurting the people. So hell for Jesus is an object lesson to protect you from people who may hurt you, from people who abuse their power. Hell is Jesus' visual aid so that people know God is on their side, even when the world seems like it's not. Now, do you think Jesus had in mind Malachi's sense of fire being refining? Or do you think Jesus had in mind this unprocessed grief of vengeance and retribution? Now, let's be clear. If I die and I find out that God has been speaking through really cruel people, and there really is some literal place where it has nothing to do with leaders and systems and healing, and really it's just a scary place full of pitchforks and lakes of fire, my bad. But if that's what I find, I've already got my complaint letter sketched out, ready to go. I will tell God, this is nowhere in the Bible. This literal place of hell and all that, it's not there. The only thing, God, that you told us from prophets and Jesus, and it's in Revelation, if you think that's scary, it's in there too about healing. If you want to go there, God, your word and your words, your character and your person in Jesus, they are lockstep, that we should look for redemption in all things, that we should aim for restoration because you are a God of healing, not condemnation. And the only fire that's ever mentioned is about atonement so that new life can be more peaceful and more holy for all. Okay, heaven. None of you cared about hell anyway. We just got that out of the way just so we can get to heaven. Heaven. What does Jesus have to say about this kingdom of heaven or God's reign? Well, before he gets there, after the idea of hell gets kind of popular, some first century Jews begin to think, well, there must be an opposite to hell. Because instead of down, let's go up. And instead of bad, let's go good. And other first century Jews thought, well, that's just dumb. That's ridiculous and absurd. If God is a God of redemption, then everyone and everything will be resurrected someday, and we'll all live in this do-over all together with your grandparents and great-grandparents and everybody. And Jesus resurrected first. See, we're right. Okay? By the way, both of those ideas, early Christians couldn't really distinguish between them. They couldn't decide. So in the Apostles' Creed, you've heard it, you've said it so many times, the resurrection of the dead and the life everlasting. Those are competing ideas that are pretty much opposite. And we just said, we'll take, if you believe either of them, come on in. That's okay. But what did Jesus say? He responded to both of those and to other ideas. What did he say when one guy says, Jesus, how do I inherit eternal life? Inherit eternal life is a whole bunch different than go to heaven, right? Those are different. When Jesus responds, he tells a story about a member of a persecuted minority doing something kind. The only way that someone was going to get help is in the chaos of the world is for someone to do something kind. Elsewhere, he talks about a big feast for people who are hungry, or a welcome home for those who feel guilt, or paved gold streets when he's talking to people who are poor, or he says equal wages for those of you who've been cheated, or it's like God finds you when you are people who feel lost. And when Jesus is not talking about stories, when he's talking directly about heaven, big H, he says things like, the kingdom of heaven is near when I am near. Which doesn't sound like something way over there. He said, the kingdom of heaven is like when we feed the poor and give clothes to the needy and we give comfort to the lost. It's like that, which is not that thing over there. He says, the kingdom of heaven is coming, and it's always here. It's always here. It's here right now. It's here around you. It's here when you're together. None of that sounds to me like a prize for believing, behaving, and belonging. And again, how much do I know about what happens after we die? Zippo. If I get there and it's all pearly gates and fat baby angels and old hymns, that's fine. But if there's some people outside those pearly gates wanting to get in, I've got issues. And the history of art has issues too. If you go look at medieval art of Jesus, there's a ton of pictures about Jesus dragging people over the fence. Like you go to a baseball game, or you try to get a Red Sox ticket, and you can't get the ticket, and someone sneaks you in. Jesus is the one who sneaks you in to places where we try to hold people out. All these stories, if it's pearly gates and somewhere else, that's fine. But all the stories that God has given us, there's two things that pervade through all of them. Totally consistent. One, God's love never stops. Not in life, not in death, not for victims, not for oppressors. Second thing that pervades is there are hints of heaven right here, everywhere, and always. We are welcomed to open our eyes. So that's what you get, heaven and hell. This ain't Christian Talk Radio. This is the Bible as best as I know it. So you're welcome to follow up with me. You can send an angry email to God if you'd like. Customer service is god@gmail.com. That's the best we can do. So, but yeah, if you have questions on that and it just fascinates you, by all means, come and talk to me and we'll dig in. Peace.